One of my favorite parts of the day is when I walk in the door after a long day of work and my son, who's about 2 years old, comes running up to me and he scurries up and he just says, "Daddy," because he's so excited to see me. It doesn't matter how many times he and I perhaps Skyped or FaceTimed as his mom would hold the phone up for him during the day. It doesn't matter how many times we do that. There's no substitute for being in his presence. As we open the Bible and we're reading the storyline in Genesis and Exodus, we see that one of the primary questions is will God live with us again? We see that in Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve and humanity is banned from God's presence. So then one of the fundamental questions is will we ever get to experience God's presence again? Or will we always live in exile and separate? And in Exodus, we begin to see in early form an answer to that question. In Exodus chapter 25, God is instructing his people to build a house for him. And he says in Exodus 25, verse 8, he says, "And let them make a sanctuary, that I might dwell in their midst." If you were reading the Bible quickly, it might be something that you fly over and you don't see how important that verse is. But here, God is dwelling. He promises to dwell in the midst of his people. This is a reversal of all the curses and the curses that we see in Genesis chapter 3, that we will no longer live in exile, but we will get to live in God's presence. And in Christ, we see this exact same promise. John uses this exact same terminology in John chapter 1 when he says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." This same language is used to show that in Christ, God has come to be with us, to dwell in our presence, so that we won't have to live in exile forever. But what does this mean for us? Well, I think your fundamental desire, my fundamental desire, our fundamental longing is to be in the presence of God. Whether you know it or not, to dwell and live in his presence is at the very core of who you are and what you want. A.W. Tozer has a fantastic quote when he says this. He says, "I want the presence of God himself, or I don't want anything at all to do with religion. I want all that God has, or I don't want any." I think that gets it exactly right, because in that quote, Tozer is reminding us that the fundamental purpose of the Christian faith, the fundamental claim, is that God is with us in Christ. As you read the book of Exodus, specifically God's plans to dwell with his people, I want you to remember that in Christ, God has come to be with you. These stories ought to remind us that we ought to yearn, to long for, and desire the presence of God.